Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We just started with two ayat from the Quran. In Surah Hujarat, ayah number 13. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم والله إن الله عليم خبير. Let me just repeat the ayah in Surah Hujarat, ayah number 13. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in addressing mankind, O mankind, indeed we have created you as men and women, or as man and woman, or male and female, and we have made you into tribes and nations, لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you may get to know each other. The specific scale of the verb, if you look at the grammar of this word ta'aruf, it indicates something done one to another. So it's not just arafu, to know or to get to know, but ta'arafu, to get to know each other. So the shu'ub and the qaba'il should get to know each other. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says in Surah Al-Rum, ayah 22, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالِمِينَ. And Allah says, and from His signs is the creation of the samawat, the skies, the heavens, wal-ard, and the earth, and waqtilaf, and the differences or the diversity in the alsina, the tongues, the languages that you speak, wa-alwanukum, and the colors, the types of people that there are in the world. Inna fi dhalika la'ayatin lil'alimin. Surely in that is a sign, or are signs for those with sound knowledge. If we think of all of us, as ulama, not in the sense of having knowledge of the deen, but just having sort of common sense. If we think about this, that Allah has created us into these different people, different colors, different languages, different nations, different tribes. Allah directly tells us that in these differences, it is a sign for you that can think, that has this knowledge. So the talk today is titled Islam and Culture. And as Muslims, we are all well acquainted with what Islam is. It is the submission to what Allah wants, and the submission to the deen that He has laid forth for us. But what does the word culture mean? We think of it as our traditions. We think of it as the things we do, the food we eat, the clothes we wear. The commonalities between specific groups, within those groups. But if we look at the Oxford Dictionary and just look at the dictionary meaning of the word culture, it defines it as being the customs and beliefs, art, way of life, and social organization of a particular country or group. So, this is, as I've explained, it's sort of commonalities within specific groups or within countries and so forth. And just unpacking a bit on this term of culture, we can think of it as, it explained within a country or within a group. So as South Africans, we have got a culture, right? But within South Africa, let's say within the Western Cape, there are specific cultural traits that us as Cape Townians have that we don't necessarily share with Joburgers or Durbanites or people from Mafeking, for example. And then within the Western Cape, as Muslims, we have our own culture that we share with each other that we don't necessarily share with non-Muslims, within Cape Town or within the Western Cape. And then within the Muslim community, you have different groups that happen to form due to different reasons, which I will unpack as well, which cause there to be, let's say the if you want to call it Malay or Cape Muslim community, cultural traits that form amongst them, or the Kanamia community that have their own cultural traits, or the Kokani community that have their own cultural traits. So, from that perspective, the Indian merchant class community, within them are even more, sub-cultural traits. So I think it's a good. So within culture, when dealing with culture, another word that comes to mind is heritage. And I will be going off on a bit of a tangent, but this tangent is important in light of the topic and in light of Muslims, especially around the globe. And that is the word of heritage, right? What is heritage? If we look at this word, if we look at where the word comes from, words that relate to it is words like inheritance, that which you inherit. So your heritage is that which you have inherited from those before you, right? And in your culture, part of your culture is your heritage, right? Your culture are those traits, those cultural traits that you have inherited from those before you that you share with others. But heritage itself can also then be split into two different categories, right? You have your tangible heritage, the heritage that you can touch, you can feel, you can see, and then you have your intangible heritage, which is this culture, which is not necessarily, touchy-feely, if you want to use that word, which are our cultural traits, our practices, for example, like in our dialects, right? Within specific cultures, within Cape Town or within South Africa, for example, right? There are these, things you can't touch and feel. These are your intangible heritage, within the city or within the country alone. And then contrasting that, you then have your tangible heritage. This is the heritage that you can feel, that you can touch, that you can hold. And a primary aspect or a primary signifier of tangible heritage is nature. So another word for tangible heritage is natural heritage, right? And the words are actually interchangeable: natural heritage, tangible heritage. And when we speak about natural heritage, we are talking about the nature around us, the environment around us. The land the land that we grew up in, for example, the mountains is part of our natural heritage. Our people that have been here before us, that was part of the environment, that was part of the nature that they grew up in. And then, just following on that is the actual plant species and the waterways and, water itself as being natural heritage of that as greater mankind we share. And if we look into our deen, it speaks so much about preserving nature, preserving the natural heritage. In Sahih Bukhari, if I'm not mistaken, there is an entire chapter that is devoted to farming, right? But if we think about farming, it is utilizing the natural heritage for the benefit of mankind. But with that right of using the natural heritage also comes the responsibility of preserving and sustaining the environment. Right? There's another hadith where I can't remember the exact wording of it, but if you're using the water of a river, for example, don't even let a drop of that water be wasted. we think if you're standing by the river, there's so much water, right? What do we think about wasting the water? We don't think about wasting it because there's so much water. But using the principles of our deen and the teaching of our deen is that even that one drop of water is sacred, and it should be, conserved and spared from wastage, right? So, that aside of, going into the natural heritage, which is not part of the type of culture that we perceive in our daily thinking, perhaps, it is still, sort of a tangible culture that we have maintained over millennia. And I actually think that is one of the most important aspects that we should be preserving, which is the natural culture around us, the culture that exists, which unfortunately, due to global warming, due to so many different issues at hand, is being degraded by the day. And I feel that is one point that as a Muslim community we have not been addressing enough. But moving back to the topic at hand, which is Islam and culture, or the culture that we attach to the word culture, which is our traditions and the norms of the communities and so on. Let us just look at what Islam says about culture. Right? I have already quoted 2 ayat in the Quran where Allah spoke about creating us into these different tribes and nations, right? And then reaffirming also that not only are you tribes and nations, but you're also different colors, and you have different tongues, you speak different languages. Tongues can even be expounded upon in the sense of dialects, not just the languages. We know that the Prophet himself was respectful of other people's languages and dialects. For example, when he I think on one of his travels, when he moved to one of the eastern parts of Arabia, there was a community or a tribe of Muslims that instead of saying the definite article al, they said And when the Prophet went there and he engaged with these people, he spoke like that. He used instead of al. So this shows the level of respect that our Nabi had for people of other tongues, of other languages. And us too should be mindful of that. So, Islam is very accepting of the different aspects of culture, which is language, one of which is language. But when we think of culture, it doesn't just refer to or rather it's not just the cultural practice in the smaller sense that we think of, like for example in Cape Town, we're all familiar with, like the Khadat and the Maulud and those things. Like, to us, that is just cultural practices that we are doing. I will expand a bit about on that. But within the law or the Sharia, there is a concept called urf, right? Urf is also the culture or there is a actual meaning that I looked at by Muhammad Hashim Kamali. He's an Afghani scholar. He's still alive, if I'm not mistaken. And he is currently, I think, the CEO or founder of one of the big Islamic institutes in Malaysia. And he wrote a whole book about Islamic law. And one of the chapters, I think it was chapter 13, was on this concept of urf, which is culture. Right. I can't seem to find my notes on that, the exact wording that he used. But basically it was cultural practice done by a majority within a specific place that is done repetitively. And he mentions in there the word aida, right? Aida meaning also the customs. That's the word that I wanted to get to earlier. Aida being the customs of a specific people. And how within Islamic jurisprudence, in the event that there is no actual text or law that deals with a specific topic, the next option is then to go to the urf of the people. What are the customs of these people? And then you use that to apply it into the law. I can't think of any of the examples that he used at this moment, but he mentioned that even within certain parts of inheritance laws, where there's no exact text to deal with a specific issue, or what was one of the other ones that he quoted? I feel that, as anyone that's watching this talk or attending here right now should make an effort to go and read this paper of his where he deals with this issue, just to give us some insight into the importance of customs and, the situations and the social circumstances happening in a land at a specific point in time. How important that is when making, fiqh rulings. I think one of the issues that he mentioned in there was of Imam al-Shafi'i when he was in Iraq. He wrote specific laws, so he came to, certain conclusions about, the fiqh. And then he moved to Egypt, and he saw that it was a totally different social circumstance going on there. And then he had to, he review his own legal opinions that he had made and change it based on the social circumstances that were at hand there. So similarly, as Cape Townians, we can think of it as, we are a Muslim community, for all intents and purposes. Yes, we have our divisions amongst ourselves, but we are a Muslim community within the West, within a secular country. And so our social circumstances are not exactly the same as one within a Muslim country, for example, in whether we are in Egypt or Saudi Arabia or 600 years back when, things were quite different. We are dealing with so many different challenges, or so many different types of ease that we have today, so many different types of convenience that was not around 600 years ago, 1200 years ago, for example. And so I am not a scholar. I cannot make any, deductions, from the law or say that anything should be changed. But based on my reading and based on what the ulama of before have done is, examining the social circumstance, looking at, the laws that can be changed based on social circumstances, and then applying the knowledge of the current social circumstances to that laws so that it fits, the time frame. Of course, there are many laws that are, set in stone, cannot be changed, textually proven, etc. But, upon reading and upon learning and upon being taught by the many ulama that we have here in Cape Town, that many of us learn from and sit at the feet at, we can then realize the need for this, and we can say these things without feeling shy about it. We are not challenging the deen, but rather we are saying that 50 years ago and now times have changed, right? I'm not a scholar. I'm not going to say which certain things should be changed, but definitely because things have evolved so quickly, times have changed so fast. Certain things that need to be re-examined and re-looked at, the things that are not set in stone. So that is just the concept of urf. That is the legal aspect of it. And so, coming back to the earlier definition of culture, where it is, let me just recap, which is the customs and beliefs, art, way of life, and social organization of a particular country or group. What about all the cultural practices that are not necessarily applicable to Islamic law, applicable to the fiqh, right? So that is all the other types of cultural practices, like our clothing that we wear, the type of language that we use, even if it sounds vulgar to some people, but within our community certain words are not regarded as vulgar. Just for one example, the food we eat, the adhkar that we make as sub communities, within the greater Muslim community. What about those things? And so speaking to certain scholars and examining some of the texts, what is quite clear is that culture that is not in conflict with the deen and with the sharia, with the Quran, with the sunnah, then becomes accessible. I mean, not accessible, it then becomes acceptable. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't get to the word. And these are the things like the clothing that you wear, right? because my research is focused on the Malay community, the Cape Muslim community, I'm going to focus on that part for this next bit. If we look at the traditional clothing of the Malay community over time, for example, right? Initially, our clothing was very much Indonesian based, because a lot of the culture that was brought to the Cape by the earliest Muslims was brought from, the Southeast Asian islands, which is present-day Indonesia. So a lot of the clothing that we wore was of Indonesian origin. But there was no conflict with what the Sharia says about, your aura and certain types of dress and so on. And so it was permissible. And then we look at a different time period, or let's just go back to that time period and think of some of the headgear that was worn. They would have worn a type of headdress that they call the calabash, which was really just a type of cloth that they wrapped tightly around the head. It wasn't as big as a turban, but it was like a do-rag. Is that what people call those things? It wasn't too dissimilar from that. And then in addition to that, they would have worn, the cloth or the tuk around it to create the type of turban that we see in some of the earlier photographs. Also, what the local Muslims used to wear is something called a turang, which is like a conical straw hat, right? Which was, quite. It was a marker of the Malay artisans at the Cape. Your fishermen, your tradesmen, and so on. And then shortly after, you see an individual coming to Cape Town by the name of Abu Bakr Effendi. He was a Turkish scholar. I'm not going to go too much in depth about that, about his presence here in Cape Town, but with his coming, there was then a greater connection between the Cape and the Ottoman territories, right? But from photographs and from knowledge about that period, the turban was still a very common thing in Cape Town, right? Only in roughly the 1890s do we see a new type of headgear and a new type of clothing then dominating the Cape, and that is the red kufiya and the suit, right? And if we look at that time period, we see that quite a number of young Cape Muslims, young Malay people going to study at Al-Azhar in Egypt, right? Al-Azhar was one of the sort of an Ottoman territory, sort of. It was known as the Khedive of Egypt at the time. And the administrative uniform of the Ottoman territories at the time was a suit and a red kufiya. So when these Malay people who dress with their Indonesian style or some Hijazi influence here and there, go study there and come back, they then bring new, cultural dress to the Cape, and a new cultural fashion then emerges amongst the Cape Muslims at the time, which is the red kufiya and the suit, right? And that's sustained at the Cape for, I think, not to my memory, but when I speak to like my parents' generation, they can remember their grandparents always wearing the red kufiya, perhaps tilted to the side or something, and the suit. And then we start seeing more and more people then going to study at at some of the institutions in Saudi Arabia, such as, whether it's in Riyadh or Makkah or Medina and so forth. And they then bring it wasn't really Hijazi, but what is now traditionally a Saudi Arabian style clothing, which is your white salah top that we see everywhere these days, the different types of kufiyas that people wear. Some of the ulama in Cape Town, they wear the red scarf, which is, the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia is quite popular. And so we can see that these are all cultural issues, which is not at conflict with the religion at all, right? There's no conflict with the way we dress as Muslims, or the ways that we have dressed as Muslims with the deen. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is just to note that there has been different types of cultural dress practiced at the Cape, right? And hence different types of culture practiced at the Cape, different types of culture imported to the Cape at the time, and it was all accepted, right? The fact that I'm wearing this kufiya now, it makes me seem a bit outdated, right? Because nobody wears it anymore. It's not part of Cape fashion. So as much as we reminisce on the kufiya and why do people not wear the kufiya anymore and all these other things, we should also then realize that before the red kufiya, there was another type of headgear that people used to wear. We don't reminisce about that. We reminisce about the red kufiya. And so now that people are wearing a different type of headgear or different type of clothing, we should then appreciate it or realize it as being a new sort of Muslim global cultural fashion trend that is dominating at the current moment. And what I've noticed is that there's a lot of insult directed at the new type of clothing that we wear as a community, as a Muslim community, which I believe simply is because of this misunderstanding of this point that the clothing that we're wearing is just the dominant Muslim fashion at the time, the dominant culture at the time. Previously it was the Ottoman Empire, and so the dominant culture was the Ottoman clothing. Before that, we came from Southeast Asian island people, and they had a different type of dominant cultural dress at the time. And then when we come to the issue of languages and speech at Cape Town, Arabic, yes, of course, it's Allah has chosen Arabic as being, the language for the Quran, right? The Quran was revealed to the Nabi. The best of creation was born Arab speaking, right? And so there is merit in learning the Arabic language to be able to understand the Quran, to read the Quran, because you get rewarded for every letter you are reciting. There's merit in striving to trying to learn it and trying to understand it. But the fact that Allah says in the Quran that I've created you into that He is one of the signs is the creation of the heaven and the earth, and the diversity in language. This shows that we aren't supposed to all speak the same language, right? Muslims are not only supposed to be Arab speaking, right? Allah says and He affirms that He has created us as being of different tongues, right? Of having different languages. And so when it comes to speech that we use, like for example, salah, right? We use the word salah in Cape Town. It is an Arabic word, right? It means prayer. But if you look in the Quran, salah can have different meanings. It's not restricted to, the prayer, the type of set prayer that we do 5 times a day. Similarly for Hajj, similarly for many other types of words. And there's no compulsion in using these Arabic words, right? So if we just analyze the word shukran, for example, right, a word that is, pervaded here in the Cape, it means thanks, right? It's just an expression of thanks, of gratitude, right? But if we look in the context of Cape Town, a word that was previously used is tramakasi, right? If we look at why that word was used, up until at least 1870, the Muslim community at the Cape they were basically Malay speaking, right? They spoke the Bahasa Melayu, Bahasa Indonesia today, and we find like kitabs or documents from that time period, some getting less and less up until like the early 1900s. Even the tombstones in the Tanah Baru, even the tombstones in the Mowbray Kubus has writing in this Malay or Jawi script that we call, which highlights the fact that these people here at the Cape, although they were of diverse origins, of diverse ethnicities, diverse colors and diverse peoples, the lingua franca was Malay, right? Because this is the language that the scholars that came here spoke up until that time. And it's from this language, which was the lingua franca, that we find this remnant word of tramakasi. Now, if we just analyze this word tramakasi, tramakasi means I receive, your love or this affection from you. So when you are giving me something, you are giving it with this love. And so when I say tramakasi, I am affirming this from you. And something that we have locally created here in Cape Town, which is perhaps a translation from the original Malay word, is kasi for Allah, right? We say, yes, you have accepted this love from me, but the love is actually for and from Allah, ultimately. So if we think about the word shukran, which just means thanks, But we think about this beautiful concept of love attached to these words of terima kasih and kasih for Allah. I mean, which one? I'm not here to say how people should speak. Of course, I just explained the issue of cultural dominance at the time, but just using common sense and embracing our culture, we can make up our own mind as to which one is preferable for ourselves. Whether it be shukran or terima kasih. This is just one example. There are many other examples. Sumbayan versus namaz versus salah. Korban versus, even the pronunciation, korban versus qurban, right? Allah says, al-sinatikum, right? Your tongues. Is that just limited to languages, or is it limited, or does it include dialects as well, right? As a community, Cape Town had some of the best tajweed. Joburg back in the day, they used to bring the Cape Town reciters to go and recite there, right? So we are known for having great tajweed. But we still kept our local or our cultural pronunciations of certain things. In our salah, we won't say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, but in the way that we speak with a dialect, but we know what we are saying, right? So, for example, the word korban, we know in Arabic it is qurban, right? But when speaking to each other, on the daily, we use the words that we would when speaking a dialect, which is korban, right? So I'm just bringing these examples to initiate some thought, around some of these topics. And then that brings us to probably one of the most controversial points, which is the religious cultural practices, within the community, which is the khadat and the mawlud and things like that. Now, I've mentioned it a few times that I'm not a scholar. I'm not here to say, what is halal, what is haram, and so on. But I'm just here to create some thinking around these topics, and just to use some. I'm not going to say logic, because some people do find that logic itself is an issue when speaking to these issues, but just to motivate people to go and find out for themselves the views or the beliefs that they feel are correct from the teachers that they follow. And this controversial point is bid'ah, the issue of innovation, right? Now, I'm sure many are acquainted that there is the difference between good bid'ah, bid'ah hasana, and bad bid'ah, bid'ah sayyah. I'm not going to speak about that at all. I'm not a scholar. There's also the very clear hadith that says كل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. Everything that is, if you want to say, new or created is an innovation. And every innovation is, it is misguidance, and all misguidance, it leads you to the fire. So, just keeping this in mind, when discussing topics of bid'ah. Again, I'm not going to explain what it is. I'm just going to mention some points to spark people to go and find out for themselves. So bid'ah is innovation, right? It is something new that is created, or something that is added. And the biggest conflict is when this innovation comes into conflict with the deen, right? When we think about bid'ah as well, it could have existed within a community before becoming Muslim, right? So they were practicing a specific cultural practice, and then, whether it was, under Islamic rule or by missionaries or whatever occurred, that a community then embraced Islam, right? So now they are stuck, right? We have these cultural practices, but now we have a religion that we follow, a way of life that we have. And now comes the process of elimination, where you have to look at the cultural practices, and then you have to look at each of them and see, right, which of them are in conflict with the deen, right? And most Muslim communities around the world that have embraced Islam, such as in the Indian subcontinent, there are different cultures, but if you're going to speak broadly, the Indian community, right? they have their own cultural practices that have been kept, after embracing Islam, that are not in conflict. If you go to Indonesia and then look at the Malay community in Cape Town, which is very much an Indonesian-based Islam, a lot of those cultural practices that they or we practice come from before we have embraced Islam. And then we embraced Islam as a community over there, and then brought here as slaves or exiles, and now forming a new community, right? There are definitely aspects of bid'ah within our culture, right? The issue is then, what is the good bid'ah and what is the bad bid'ah? And then also as Muslims, what have we created within the deen that is an innovation, and what of that is good and what of that is bad? I'm not here to give the answers. I'm just here to spark, thinking around it. And then, localizing it a bit further, as a Muslim community here in Cape Town, the Malay community, right? We look at some of the cultural practices within the religion that, are still occurring till today, Ratib, Maulud, Khadat, Khatams, and so on, right? Ratib is a very complicated topic. I'm not equipped to speak about it. I'll leave that to the scholars to speak about, because many have different opinions regarding that, because of the actions involved, right? But if we think about something like Khadat, right, most of what is in the Khadat, which is actually from of Yemeni origin, the Ratib al-Haddad, Ratib meaning a compilation of sequences, right? It's adhkar from the Sunnah, and it's ad'iyah, du'as that we're asking for Allah, and so on. And then if we look at the Khadat that's practiced in Cape Town, which is not exactly the Khadat or Haddad that Imam, or the Ratib that Imam al-Haddad wrote, it's slightly different, right? With, it has adhkar origins in many different places. And, when I was, conducting some research and looking at some old kitabs of old Hajat being synonymous for Khadat, Hajat books that people have, around the Cape, some going back to the early 1800s. There was this one ayah, I think it started with Tashbih. I can't remember exactly how it started, but it's one of the dhikrs that are still practiced in Joburg within the Malay community till today, where they start off with the Asma al-Husna, which is a remembrance or a type of drilling the Asma al-Husna into one's mind so that it's always at hand, right? The first thing. The second thing is then also the dhikr of the different names of Allah, right? And then shortly after that is then the sifat of Allah, right? The different attributes of Allah, which are not the names. And then it goes on to describe these things, right? So one of them is أول بلا ابتداء, he's the first without beginning, وآخر بلا انتهاء, and he's the last without end, right? These are aspects about belief, right? Your aqidah, that was then put into a poetic form and then memorized, right? So, if we look at Cape Town in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when some of our exiles like one guru came here, and they then started teaching these adhkar, starting the madaris, the Muslim schools here in Cape Town. These were the things that they were teaching to the people, right? It was issues of belief, issues about, your iman, what is Islam, things like that. The adhkar that the Nabi taught us in different circumstances. Some of them written by other people, some of them having, a weak status of hadith, and various things, right? But it had a good intention, and if we again look at the context, this is a group of slaves, right? Most of them, or many of them at least, are not grounded in the deen. Their names are stripped away from them. Their marriages are not recognized. Their children are ripped away from them. And you have these individuals trying, to find the bare minimum for these people to do that will keep them together. And that was starting these, circles of clandestine remembrance, right? And, how do we make it so that they can remember what they are saying, um, and that we can also teach them what they are saying, and that they can also know what they believe in. And that is how a lot of these things spread here in Cape Town. So yes, we can think about bid'ah and the bad bid'ah, and these things, but a fact is that what kept the Muslim community alive in Cape Town are these circles of remembrance, are these aspects of or these occurrences of the Muslims coming together to remember Allah, right, in the way that they were taught was right. And then also just looking at a historical anecdote, right? The first writing about Muslim practice at the Cape, in South Africa for that matter, was in, I think it was the 1770s, 1780s, a traveler by the name of Carl Thunberg. He comes to the 1772, he comes to the Cape, and he comes across these Malay people. I think they were Javanese at the time. The community had different names under different periods. So he comes across this community or this group of Javanese people, and he says they are reciting the Quran, but if we look at the date and if we look at the circumstance, it appears to be the Mawlud, right? So this is a time period where he also describes the priests among them, which we can identify to be certain political exiles, right? So these are political exiles, slaves, local indigenous and slave converts, joining in one community for the sake of Allah, right? And remembering, our Nabi, right, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But within remembering the birth of the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam also occurs, adhkar, right? So you're remembering Allah. So the reason for them coming together was for Allah, right? And this aspect of Mawlud, or this occurrence of Mawlud, continued till today, where it's still being celebrated in the Cape. So yes, some people are of the opinion that it is a bid'ah and it is wrong and we shouldn't be doing it. But a fact is that the Muslim community exists in Cape Town till today. We are a very strong community, which, I would like to say we are a community with lots of iman and taqwa, looking at, the old people amongst us and, how they are trying to advise the youth. Yeah, and sorry, I just need to recap my thoughts. So the fact is that they did practice these different, types of cultural practices, which is not necessarily from, the Quran or the Hadith per se, within the Khadat or in the Hajjah or so. But if again we look at this word ratib, and we think of urf and we think of ada, which is and a key element that ties them all together is the concept of repetition, right? And if you ask some of the older people in the Muslim community in Cape Town, or some of the youth that are reminded about this, it is the word tartib, right? If you say someone is tartib, it means they are on their deen, they are practicing, they're doing things as they should be, within the urf of the community, right? But this word tartib, it comes from this, the word, repetition and done in the specific sequence. And if we look at it in light of, the cultural and historical context in Cape Town, where you are this group of slaves and exiles, you are removed from the greater, Muslim community around the world, and this is what you have, right? You enforce it to the best of your ability, right? Certain, your adhkar and your salah and your salawat and all these things, right? You practice it in the way that you were taught, and you don't exceed those boundaries, right? You stick to the tartib because that is safe, right? And that keeps you to the deen, and it keeps you, in the boundaries of Islam that was set by the teachers at the time. And I feel, alhamdulillah, that the tartib was enforced in Cape Town as part of our culture, because it allowed us to stick to the deen in Cape Town. And then just the last point, and I know it's nearing Maghrib, so I have to be brief. is, the issue of intolerance, right? With culture, I mentioned all the good things, but there are also the bad things that comes with culture, right? The prejudices within some cultures against others, or within cultures for them, for members within the culture, or within the community itself, um, such as the issue of colorism within many Muslim communities around the world, right? Within the community, not just against other communities. Um, you know, I'm sure many are aware of within India, in India, some of the issues, that they face with colorism there, where, yes, within the Hindu community as well as Indians, but also within the Muslim community, the skin whitening creams that they use and so on. I can't speak much about that because I don't have much experience or knowledge researching that. But what I can speak about is within the Muslim community, right? There was a very ugly word used for their own people who are of a darker skin color, which is maspika, right? Now, this word itself, it's a bit ironic because they are recognizing that as a community they also come from a African or black tributary, but when we go back to slavery, a lot of the slaves were brought from the East African coast and were brought to Cape Town as slaves, right? And they were known as maspikas because of the whole Mozambique region. But when they were brought here, many of them were Muslim, Zanzibar, big Muslim community there. But when they were brought here, some of them joined the Muslim community, right? And they were darker skin, coarser hair, so on. And their descendants, or amongst them themselves, right, were then referred to as the Masbikas. Not necessarily derogatory, but just referring to the fact that let's Masbikas, right? Or the Malays or the Java is from Java, right? But later on, when this issue of colorism became more and more prevalent, we then see, members of families being referred to as Aisa Maspika or Hulis Maspikas, and it became a very derogatory thing, within Cape Town. And this is something that, we're not going to deny, it's part of our culture, but it is it's in contradiction with the deen, where Allah, not Allah, but the Nabi says that the Arab is not superior over the non-Arab, and the non-Arab is not superior over the Arab, and the wording is, the Ahmar, the red-skinned people, people with you want to say lighter-skinned people is not more superior over darker-skinned people, and darker-skinned people is not more superior over lighter-skinned people, right? That was the speech or the khutbah that the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam gave on Arafah, right? This shows us how important it is not to, judge based on color, not to call each other these derogatory terms based on color, right? And again, in there and in the Quran, in Surah Hujarat, Allah says, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, right? The key point with all of this is that despite all of your differences and despite how you yourselves want to judge each other, none of that matters. What matters is taqwa, right? And so when you want to, call each other derogatory terms and all these things, right, your taqwa then decreases, right? Because you are not following, according to how it should be followed. But taqwa is the main principle with regards to this. And then I just want to end off with something that I wanted to mention that I forgot about, actually. That was the issue of Sayyidatina Aisha. She was standing with the Nabi in the courtyard of, I think, of one of the masajid. I can't remember which one it was. Masjid Nabawi. Okay, it was from the audience. It's Masjid Nabawi. But basically, Sayyidatina Aisha was standing with the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, her husband, and they were watching these Habashis, these Abyssinians, dancing with spears, which was their cultural practice at the time. And in one narration, I think it mentioned that, Sayyidina Umar cautioned them to stop this, and then the Prophet said, no, carry on. And then he allowed Sayyidatina Aisha to continue watching, and then he asked her, is this sufficient for you? And she said yes, and then she left. But this hadith shows the acceptance of cultural participation, and also respecting other people's cultures, where he then stood there quietly and watched them out of respect for them. So it is now Maghrib, so I do hope that this talk was beneficial. I'm not a scholar, as I've mentioned many times. I'm barely even a student of knowledge, if even. But I do hope that it was beneficial, and I do hope that I did not come to provide answers, but I came to spark thinking around this topic, and to motivate the action of going to seek more knowledge around this topic. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum.